Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today we're going to really put on our thinking caps, our philosopher hats, if you will, and try to get to the bottom of something that's been a core question in philosophy for ages.
Ooh, I like that. Philosopher hats on.
Right. What's the actual difference between what something is, its essence, its fundamental nature, and the simple fact that it exists at all? I mean, on the
Yeah.
surface, it seems pretty straightforward.
Uh-huh.
But as we dig deeper, trust me, it gets really complex and surprisingly thought-provoking, almost like peeling back the layers of an onion, you might say.
That's a great analogy, actually.
Yeah.
And it really highlights how this seemingly simple distinction between what something is and that it is has become a fundamental dividing line in philosophical inquiry. And so for today's deep dive, we're going to be exploring how a whole tradition of brilliant thinkers, the Islamic philosophers, grappled with this very question. We're talking about a period spanning from the 9th century all the way to the 17th century.
Wow, that's a huge span of time.
It is. And they really built upon a rich foundation of Greek philosophy, but also forged their own unique paths, leading to some really fascinating and surprising developments.
I'm excited to dig in.
Me too. And as always, we have a fantastic source to guide us on this journey. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Essence and Existence in Arabic and Islamic Philosophy.
Perfect. Okay, so we're talking about a vibrant intellectual tradition, centuries of debate, a fundamental philosophical problem. Where do we even begin? What's our mission for this deep dive?
Well, I think our main goal should be to understand the core arguments that were developed around essence and existence within Islamic philosophy, to see how this debate evolved over time, and perhaps most importantly, to understand why this centuries-old question still has so much relevance for philosophical thought even today.
All right, let's sharpen our minds and get started. So let's rewind the clock all the way back to the early period of falsafa, as they called it.
Yes, falsafa. Essentially, that's the term for philosophy within this tradition. And in those early days, the distinction between essence and existence wasn't something that was always made explicitly.
Okay, interesting.
So if we take someone like Al-Kindi, who was writing in the 9th century, for him, the idea of being was basically the same as what something is.
So to use our trusty example, if we think about a cup, for Al-Kindi to say that a cup is just means that it possesses all the properties that make it a cup.
Exactly. There's no additional idea of existence added on top of that. Now, he did use words like ania, alles, and huia, which we might translate as existence. But the key is, for him, these words weren't referring to some separate layer of reality. They were just different aspects of what it meant for something to be that thing.
Got it. So it was all wrapped up together. The being was the whole package. And this
Yeah.
actually has some interesting implications when we consider his view of God, right?
Absolutely. Al-Kindi famously described God as pure being, ania fakoi. But importantly, this wasn't the same as the argument we'll see later from Avicenna about God's essence being existence. For Al-Kindi, it was more about God's simplicity, that God's essence isn't composed of separate attributes.
Right, so a theological point rather than a purely metaphysical one.
Exactly. Now let's jump ahead a bit to the 10th century, to Al-Farabi. With him, we start to see the term wujud existence being used in a more prominent and nuanced way. This is where we begin to see the seeds of a distinction being sown.
Seeds of distinction, I like that. It sounds like we're about to witness a philosophical garden begin to grow. Okay, so tell me, how does Al-Farabi start to unpack this concept of wujud? What are the different senses of existence that he identifies?
Well, he talks about these two. One is what he calls existence as a secondary intelligible, in Arabic, makul thani.
Okay, secondary intelligible. Let's translate that into plain English. What did he mean by that?
Think of it like this. You have the mental blueprint for something, like a horse.
Okay, got it.
So when we say horses exist, what we're really saying is that this mental blueprint, this concept of horse, actually has real-world counterparts. There are actual horses out there.
Yeah.
So existence, in this sense, is like a label that we apply to some of our concepts. It means has real-world instances. It's about our mental ideas having a connection to the real world, not about some property of the real objects themselves.
Right, so it's almost like a property of our thoughts. They have this existence property if they refer to something in reality, and this is where the classic example of aliens comes in handy.
Yes, yeah. Really?
When we say aliens don't exist, we're not saying there's no concept of alien. We can clearly imagine them.
Yeah.
What we're saying is that right now, at least, this concept doesn't have any real-world counterparts. It's a mental blueprint without a corresponding building, so to speak. So even if Al-Farabi doesn't explicitly say it, this idea of secondary intelligible does seem to imply a conceptual gap, at least, between existence and the essence of things, the whatness of things.
Absolutely. The concept of a cup is different from the concept of a horse. Their essences are distinct. But when we say cups exist and horses exist, the predicate of existence is the same. However, it's important to note that Al-Farabi also talks about a second way of thinking about existence, where it's less about this labeling and more about simply possessing a certain essence outside of our minds.
Okay, so here it's not a separate label.
Right. It's more like existence is intertwined with and in a way even identical to the real objects themselves.
So for a cup to be still fundamentally means to be a cup in the actual world.
Precisely.
It almost sounds like he's caught between two positions here.
Right.
On the one hand, there's that conceptual difference he hints at with the secondary intelligible idea.
Yeah.
But then, this second sense seems to pull him back towards a more unified view, where existence is just the actuality of an essence. It's like he's almost there, on the verge of making a sharp distinction, but then pulls back a bit.
I think that's a very insightful observation. Al-Farabi seems hesitant to fully commit to a complete metaphysical separation between essence and existence.
Fascinating. Okay, so we've got this tension building within falsafa. But now let's shift gears a bit and look at a parallel tradition that was developing alongside falsafa, kalam,
Yes, Kala.
often translated as Islamic theology.
Right.
But it's important to remember that it had its own sophisticated philosophical framework, often engaging with different questions and approaches compared to the Greek-influenced falsafa. And within Kalam, there were two major schools of thought that are super relevant to our discussion, the Mutazilites and the Asharites.
Absolutely. And they had some really contrasting views on this whole issue of essence and existence.
Okay, so let's start with the Mutazilites, specifically the Basran school. What were their key ideas?
So the Basra Mutazilites developed this fascinating theory where they argued that objects, which they called dawat, actually had a kind of ontological status even before God bestowed existence wujud upon them.
Hold on, so even before God created them.
That's right.
What did that even mean?
It's a bit mind-bending, I know. But you can think of it like they're blueprints for all possible things. And these blueprints exist these blueprints to actually bring into being.
Wow. Okay, so it's not that the things themselves existed beforehand, but their blueprints, their essences did.
In a way, yes. And this connects to their famous slogan, which might sound a bit strange at first. The non-existent is a thing. Amadum Shea.
I was hoping you'd bring that up. It does sound strange. So are they saying that things that don't exist still have some kind of reality?
Yes, in a sense. Their concept of reality, Thubu, was broader than just what actually exists. It included possibilities, things that could be but aren't yet. And this actually has some interesting connections to later philosophical ideas about possible worlds and even the nature of intentionality.
Right, because if we wish for something that doesn't exist, our wish is still directed at something. So maybe that points to some kind of reality for non-existent things.
Exactly. The source material actually points out some fascinating parallels between this Mutazilite view and the ideas of Maimonideanism. It's a school of thought that argues that we can have meaningful thoughts and intentions about things that don't exist, which suggests that these things must have some kind of being.
It's a fascinating and very counterintuitive idea, isn't it? It challenges our basic assumptions about what it means to be real. Okay, so for the Mutazilites, the whatness of a thing, its essence, has a kind of priority. It exists, in some sense, even before it's actually brought into being. And this leads to their idea that being existent, Mawjud, is a kind of state that's added onto objects, not a fundamental part of them.
Exactly. It's not intrinsic to the object, but comes from outside of it. Can you tell me a little more about their understanding of these states? I know they were big on categorizing different aspects of reality.
Yes, absolutely. So in the traditional Kalam framework, you have the basic building blocks of reality called Jawahir, which are basically substances. Think of them like the fundamental ingredients of existence.
Yeah.
And then you have Araq, which are the qualities that inhere in these substances, like color, shape, or size.
Like the redness of an apple or the roundness of a ball.
Precisely. But then along comes Abu Hashim al-Juba, one of the key figures in the Basran school, and he throws a wrench into this system. He introduces a third category, afwal, which are states. And these are neither substances nor qualities in the usual sense.
Okay, a third category. That's interesting.
They're described as being neither existent nor non-existent, which sounds kind of paradoxical, I know. Maybe an analogy can help. Think of the state of being married. It's not like there's a separate entity called marriage that exists alongside the two people, but it's a real characteristic that applies to them by virtue of a certain relationship.
So it's not a thing, but it's still a real feature.
Exactly.
And Abu Hashim offered other examples, like the state of desiring, which he said arises from the quality of desire, or the state of occupying space, which he considered inherent in substances. So how did the idea of being existent fit into this intricate system of categories? Was it a substance, a quality, or one of these mysterious states?
That's the key point. For the Mutazilites, being existent, what they called Khan Majudin, was considered a state. It's not a fundamental substance. It's not one of the inherent qualities. It's this additional thing that characterizes an object but doesn't exist as a separate entity.
Okay, so it's a state, which means it's not a thing in itself, but a way a thing is,
Right. And they viewed it as extrinsic. It's not something that comes from within the object itself.
which fits their view of creation.
Exactly. God is the one who bestows existence upon things. But the crucial point is that they didn't think there was some inherent existence entity within the objects themselves that God was somehow activating.
Fascinating. So existence is this added feature, a state that characterizes an object, but not a fundamental building block of its being.
Right. A very specific way of thinking about it. Okay, so now let's bring the Asherites into the picture. They were often a bit more, shall we say, conservative in their views. How did they react to all this?
Well, the Asherites were pretty much opposed to this entire way of thinking.
Not a fan of all these abstract categories.
Not really, no. They strongly emphasized the absolute power of God and the total dependence of creation upon him. They argued that things had no metaphysical status whatsoever before God created them.
Okay, so none of this blueprint stuff.
Nope. For them, things were entirely dependent on God for both their essence, what they are, and their existence that they are.
So a much stronger emphasis on God's creative power.
Absolutely. And they were really adamant that only existent things are real.
Right. So that Metazolite slogan about the non-existent is a thing, that was a hard pass for the Asherites.
Exactly. There's no separate realm of potentiality or preexistence for them.
So how did they deal with the intentionality argument? You know, the idea that because we can think about non-existent things, that must mean they have some sort of reality.
They had a clever response to that. They said that we conceive of non-existent things on the supposition of their existence, ala takdir al-wujud. Now, the exact meaning of this phrase is debated, but the general idea is that our ability to think about something non-existent doesn't actually give it any independent reality. It's a mental exercise, a kind of hypothetical scenario.
So just because we can imagine a unicorn doesn't mean there's a unicorn essence floating around somewhere.
Exactly. And what about the Mutazilite idea of being existent as a separate state? Did they buy that at all?
Well, that was a big nope. Even those Asherites who accepted some elements of the theory of states were totally against this idea of being existent being one of them. They argued that any apparent similarity in the concept of existence, when we say, for example, humans exist and cups exist, is purely verbal.
It's just the way we use language,
Yeah.
not a reflection of some underlying reality.
Exactly. So for the Asherites, essence and existence are fundamentally inseparable, both entirely contingent on God's creative act.
Right. They're two sides of the same coin, you could say.
Okay, so we've got these two very different approaches within Kalam. The Mutazilites with their pre-existent essences and states, and the Asherites with their emphasis on God's absolute power and the inseparability of essence and existence. Now, let's move on to the real heavyweight champion in this debate, Avicenna. His synthesis basically set the stage for all the discussions that followed.
He's definitely the pivotal figure. Avicenna, or Ibn Sina, really took both the Falsafa and the Kalam traditions and forged his own path in the 11th century. And his key contribution, the thing that had the most lasting impact, was establishing a real distinction between essence and existence. And his central argument, which is surprisingly simple, was this really profound insight that kind of broke apart this unity that everyone had assumed before between essence and existence.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this argument.
It all hinges on this idea that we can clearly conceive of what something is, its essence, without necessarily knowing whether it actually exists. You know, we can imagine a unicorn, we can picture a mountain made of pure gold.
Right.
But that doesn't mean these things actually exist in the real world.
Of course.
So Avicenna's reasoning goes like this. If something is truly essential to something else, then we can't conceive of one without the other. But we can conceive of the essence of a horse, all those defining characteristics that make it a horse, without knowing if any horses actually exist right now.
So that means existence can't be part of the essence of a horse.
Exactly. Essence and existence must be conceptually distinct.
That's a pretty powerful argument, and I know Avicenna was also critical of thinkers who seemed to suggest that to exist simply meant to be a certain kind of thing, which he called the equivocity of existence. Why did he reject that view?
Well, he used a similar line of reasoning. If to exist just meant to have a certain essence, then the statement horses exist would be the same as saying horses are horses, which is clearly not the case. There's extra information contained in the statement horses exist that goes beyond just the definition of a horse.
Right, because it tells us that this concept we have, this essence, is actually instantiated in the real world. It's not just a mental construct.
Exactly. So Avicenna makes a strong case for conceptual distinction between essence and existence. But it's important to note, as the source material points out, that he's not necessarily saying that they're totally separate entities out there in the world.
Right, he's not going full Plato here with a realm of forms.
Not quite. He still agrees with that Asherite intuition that in the realm of actual things, an essence only has being if it exists. He's not saying that essences are floating around somewhere waiting to be picked up by existence like the metasolites suggested.
Okay, so he's threading a very fine needle here.
He is. But he still has to deal with this issue of non-existent things. If only existing things are real, how can we even talk about things that don't exist?
Right, that was the Mutazilites' whole point. Our thoughts must be directed at something.
Exactly. And this is where Avicenna introduces his doctrine of mental existence, wujudini.
Mental existence. I've heard of this. It's a bit of a brain twister. So how does this idea help him reconcile his views?
The basic idea is that essences can have two modes of existence. They can exist externally in the concrete world, and they can exist internally within our minds. So when we think about a unicorn, even though there aren't any actual unicorns running around, the essence of unicorn still has a form of existence, but it's in our minds.
Okay, so the essence exists in our minds as a concept, even if there's no corresponding thing in the real world.
Exactly. And this allows him to kind of have his cake and eat it too. He can maintain this conceptual distinction between essence and existence, while also accounting for our ability to think about things that don't exist.
It's a clever way to address that challenge. Okay, so essences can exist mentally, but then we get to this really fascinating and much debated idea of pure quiddity, or the neutrality of essence towards existence. It almost sounds like he's going back to the Mutazilite idea of essences having some sort of priority.
I can see why you'd say that. But there's a subtle difference here. What Avicenna is saying is that if we consider an essence completely in itself, like hoarseness, just as hoarseness, stripped of any consideration of whether it's a universal concept or instantiated in a particular horse, or even just a mental image, then this essence has no inherent relationship to existence at all.
It's neither existent nor non-existent.
Exactly. It's neutral. It could be universal or particular. It could be mental or external. It could exist or it could not exist. It's open to all these possibilities. And this idea has been interpreted in various ways throughout history. Some have seen it as hinting at a kind of third realm where essences exist prior to and independent of concrete reality, kind of like that later medieval concept of esse essentiae.
Right, the being of an essence. But as I understand it, most scholars see it differently these days, right?
Yeah, the prevailing view is that this priority that Avicenna is talking about is more logical or definitional than ontological.
Meaning it's about how we define and understand things.
Right. So if we think about the essence of a particular horse, like Bucephalus, Alexander the Great's horse, we can conceive of this essence in itself. But it only actually has being, it only truly exists through its instantiation in Bucephalus.
Okay, so it's not that the essence of Bucephalus is floating around somewhere waiting to be embodied.
Exactly. The essential property is what would define Bucephalus, but that essence only comes into concrete reality. It only has being through its existence in that specific horse.
Got it. So it's a subtle point, but an important one. Avicenna is making a clear distinction between the logical order of how we define and understand things and the ontological order of what actually exists.
Okay, so that's essences in general. But when it comes to God, things get even more interesting, right? Because famously, Avicenna argues that God has no effect on essences themselves. For example, the number 4 just is even by necessity. God didn't make it that way.
Right. And this actually connects back to his distinction between essence and existence. He makes a clear division between the causes of essence and the causes of existence. For created things, their essences are just what they are, and God's role is to bring these already determined essences into being. So for Avicenna, God is the cause of existence, but not of essence.
He sets up a clear boundary there.
He does, and this leads him to develop a whole modal framework, where he distinguishes between necessary existence and contingent existence. Necessary existence, the kind that God has, means that your existence derives solely from your essence.
So God exists because of what God is. Precisely. But all other things, all created things, have contingent existence, meaning their existence is not derived solely from their essence, but is made necessary through another.
Made necessary by God, in this case.
Exactly. And he even talks about existence as a necessary concomitant, a lazim of essences, meaning that once God has established the whole causal picture, so to speak, then existence is a necessary consequence for those essences that are brought into being.
Okay, so it's still tied to God's creative act, but it's a consequence of that act, not a direct creation by God.
Right. And then, of course, we get to the big one, God. Avicenna famously argues that God's essence is existence.
The necessary existent in itself, wajib al-wujubidatihi.
Exactly. Why does he make this rather radical claim?
Well, he's trying to avoid an infinite regress, right? If God's essence were different from his existence, then God would need a cause to exist. And if that cause was something other than God's essence, then we'd have something prior to God, which contradicts the whole idea of God as the first cause, the uncaused cause.
Exactly. And if God's essence was the cause of his existence, that would also be problematic because it would mean God somehow depends on something else for his existence.
Which again contradicts the idea of God as the ultimate source of being.
Right. So for Avicenna, God's essence must be identical with his existence to avoid these logical pitfalls.
Okay, so he establishes this absolute identity between essence and existence for God. But then a new problem arises. If God is existence, how do we distinguish God's existence from the existence of, well, everything else? It's not like God just has more existence, right?
That's a great question. And this is where Avicenna introduces another important doctrine, the analogy or modulation of existence, tashkik al-wushut.
Okay, modulation of existence. Break that down for me.
It's a bit tricky, but basically it means that the word existence isn't used in a completely equivocal way.
Meaning it doesn't have totally different meanings every time we use it.
Right, and it's also not used in a purely univocal way, where it means exactly the same thing in every case. Instead, it's analogous. It applies differently depending on what exists.
So the existence of a substance, like a rock, is different from the existence of a quality, like redness.
Exactly. And the existence of a created thing is different from the existence of God. God's existence is of a higher mode, it's necessary and uncaused, and it's the very source of all other existence.
So it's not a difference in the amount of existence, but in the way existence is possessed.
Right. It's a gradation, a hierarchy of being.
A fascinating idea. So this is Avicenna's big contribution. He sets up this whole system with a clear distinction between essence and existence, a special case for God, and this doctrine of the analogy of existence. And this really laid the groundwork for all the debates that followed.
It did. And as the source material points out, one of the main things that subsequent philosophers questioned was Avicenna's assumption that a conceptual distinction between essence and existence meant there was also a real distinction out there in the world. They were essentially saying, just because we can think about them separately doesn't mean they actually are separate.
Right. That's a huge leap. Okay, so how did these post-Avicennan philosophers challenge this idea? What were their main arguments?
Well, they raised some serious problems with this idea of treating essence and existence as separate components, like Lego blocks that you can snap together or pull apart.
Right, because if they're really distinct, then what about essence all by itself?
Exactly. What is the ontological status of an essence that's not yet instantiated, that's not connected to existence? Does it exist in some shadowy realm of potential? And if so, what kind of existence does it even have? This led to all sorts of infinite regresses, as philosophers like Omar Khayyam and Al-Abari pointed out.
Right, because then you'd need a second-order existence to account for the existence of this essence and so on forever. And there's a similar problem if you try to think of existence all by itself. Does existence exist? It seems like you'd need another kind of existence to account for that, too.
Exactly. It gets very messy very quickly. And Al-Suhrawardi, another incredibly influential philosopher, even turned Avicenna's own argument against him. You remember that conceivability test?
where you can conceive of the essence of something without knowing if it exists.
Right. Well, Surowardi asked, if existence is really distinct from essence, can we conceive of the essence of existence while doubting that anything actually exists? And if we can, doesn't that mean existence itself must have an essence, which then needs to exist, and so on? It's another infinite regress.
Clever. He used Avicenna's own logic against him. So as a result of all these critiques, many philosophers started leaning towards what's called conceptualism,
Yes, conceptualism.
which basically says that there isn't a real distinction between essence and existence out there in the world. It's more about how our minds categorize things.
Right. So for the conceptualists, to exist basically means to be instantiated. It's a label our minds apply to those concepts that happen to have real-world counterparts.
So essence and existence are different concepts in our minds, but they ultimately refer to the same concrete reality.
Precisely. They both point to the same thing, the huia, the thatness of something. El-Surowardi famously described existence as a secondary intelligible. It's a concept that we predicate of other concepts. He called them primary intelligibles, like whiteness, which directly refer to qualities in the world. But existence itself doesn't refer to some separate thing.
Okay, so existence is like a label, a way we talk about things, but not a fundamental component of reality. But surely not everyone was on board with this conceptualist view, right? There must have been those who defended Avicenna's real distinction.
Oh, absolutely. There were some die-hard realists who held on to Avicenna's original vision.
So how did they try to respond to these seemingly insurmountable challenges?
Well, they had a few tricks up their sleeves. One approach was to try to be really precise about different ways we use the word exist. They argued that sometimes it's just an attribution of a property to something, like when we say this apple exists, but other times it refers to a more fundamental, self-subsistent kind of existence, like when we talk about God.
So maybe there are different kinds or levels of existence, and that avoids those infinite regresses.
Exactly. Another key strategy was what's called the non-entitativity of existence.
Non-entitativity. That's a mouthful.
I know, right? But the idea is actually pretty simple. It's the idea that existence isn't a thing itself, or even an attribute within a thing. It's more like the very being existent of a thing, or its realization or occurrence.
It's almost like saying that things don't have existence, they just are.
Exactly.
Which actually sounds a bit like that earlier Mutazilite notion of being existent as a state. It's not an entity, but a way something is.
Interesting connection. And perhaps the most prominent figure in this realist camp was Fakhr al-Din al-Razi. He even went so far as to accept a certain kind of priority of essence over existence.
Really? That's a bold move.
It is. But he was very careful to clarify that this priority was definitional or essential, not ontological.
Meaning it's about how we understand things, the logical order of our concepts, not about essences existing independently somewhere.
Exactly. It's about the architecture of our thought,
Mm.
not about a separate realm of being. And what's fascinating is that al-Razi even applied this framework to God. He argued that even for God, essence is prior to existence in this definitional sense.
So even for God, there's a distinction, at least conceptually, between what God is and that God is.
Right. But what makes God unique, according to al-Razi, is that God's essence is such that it necessitates his existence. God's essence is the cause of its own existence.
A very specific kind of essence, then.
It is. And he also advocated for the univocity of existence, which is the idea that the word existence refers to the same fundamental reality everywhere, including in God.
So there's no hierarchy of existence, like Avicenna argued.
Not for al-Razi. For him, any differences between things are due to their different essences, not to different kinds of existence. However, it's important to mention that this view, especially as applied to God, was a minority position. Most philosophers still followed Avicenna's idea, the analogy of existence, especially after al-Surowardi refined it with this concept of things being numerically distinct but sharing the same qualities to different degrees.
Okay, so different essences, same fundamental existence, but manifested to different degrees. That actually makes a lot of
And it
sense.
does. It's a very elegant way of thinking about it. But how did the conceptualists, who basically denied the reality of existence, deal with Avicenna's idea that God is existence? That seems like a tough one to reconcile.
It does.
Well, they often made a special exception for God. They argue that God is the only true instantiation of existence outside of the realm of mental concepts. Everything else, everything created, is ultimately conceptual. But God is the one truly existent thing.